Hello again. I'm Miss Nessa, and this is Community Works online songwriting class, where we learn about how our favorite music is made and we build the skills to write our own songs. Today is part 2 of our lesson on scales. Last week we learned about notes, intervals, octaves, and we learned to play 2 scales, which were C major and A minor. So if that's not ringing a bell, you might need to go back and watch last week's video, because we're going to take what we did last week, we're going to take those 2 scales and use them to find patterns that will let us figure out a bunch of other scales for ourselves. To complete this lesson, you'll need a keyboard instrument, and you should probably be in at least 3rd grade because there's a little bit of math involved. If you already know all your scales, you can spend this week practicing them to the best of your ability, because after today, I'm not going to talk about scales anymore, but they're super important for everything else we're going to do in our songwriting class. So today, first thing is to finish learning the names of all the keys, all the notes that the keyboard can play. Last week we learned 7 letter names for the white keys, right? C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. But we didn't learn the names of these black keys that sit slightly behind and in between the white keys. So these are called accidentals. And each of them has 2 names. They're named for the white key on one side and the white key on the other side. They don't get their own letter name. So let's look in the middle of the keyboard next to C, right in between C and D. This is called C sharp because it's a little bit sharper or a little bit higher than C. This is a symbol for sharp. Looks like a hashtag. Now C sharp, higher than C. But we could also call it D flat because it's a little bit lower or flatter than D. And this is a symbol for flat. It looks like a B that got flattened. So C sharp is also known as D flat. It's got an alias that it goes by. Next black key is a little higher than D, so we call it D sharp. And it's a little lower than E, so we call it E flat. So D sharp, E flat, same note. In between E and F, there isn't a black key, so there's no E sharp and there's no F flat. Next black key we have is between F and G, so we call it F sharp or G flat. Next one is between G and A, so that's G sharp, A flat. And then the last one is between A and B, so we call it A sharp or B flat. Now there's only 5 accidentals. They repeat all the way up the keyboard. So C sharp, B sharp, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, or D flat, E flat, G flat, A flat, B flat. Same thing, same notes, 2 names. Alright, so if we play those 5 notes by themselves, like I've been doing, we're playing a scale that's called a pentatonic scale. Pentatonic means 5 notes. Penta, like pentagon. So lots of traditional music in East Asia and Africa uses pentatonic scales. They're really popular all over the world. So-called Western music uses up to 12 notes, right? The 5 black keys and the 7 white keys. So 7 plus 5 is 12. If we play all those 12 notes in order, it's a scale called chromatic scale, and that just uses every note on the keyboard. So let's hear how that sounds. It might make you a little seasick, or it might sound a little creepy, right? We don't usually use all 12 of those notes. We usually use 7 of them at any given time, which is why we have to learn our major and minor scales today. Now, if we are going up chromatically, if we go up every single key, we play every black key and every white key together, the distance between each of those is called a half step. And half step is, if you're going to learn one thing today from this lesson, I want you to learn what is a half step and how do you count half steps. So a half step is the distance between any two notes that are immediately next to each other on the keyboard. So it doesn't matter if they're white or black. When you're counting half steps, you count every key as if they were in one row and as if they were all the same color. So between C and C sharp is a half step. Between C sharp and D is a half step. Between D and D sharp is a half step. Between D sharp and E is a half step. Now from E to F, remember I pointed out already there's nothing in between E and F. So from E to F is also a half step. Okay, so the half step is our smallest interval that we can use to measure other intervals. Remember last week we talked about a fifth. We said between C and G is a fifth, and it's called a fifth because in our C scale, G is the fifth note, right? We're just counting the notes in that scale. There's 8 if we count from C to C. But counting half steps is going to be different from the way we were counting notes in a scale last week, because counting half steps, again, means counting in between. We're counting these little gaps in between the keys. We're not counting the keys themselves. So, to count half steps from C to G, first of all, we're starting at C, but we don't count C. C is our starting place. C is 0. If we were putting a ruler to measure from here to here, the end of the ruler would be right here and it would say 0, right? So C is 0. We count half a step. It brings us to C sharp. We count 2 half steps to D, 3 half steps to D sharp, 4 half steps to E, 5 half steps to F, 6 half steps to F sharp, and 7 half steps from C to G. So our fifth, we measured it, it's 7 half steps. Let's look at another fifth to see if that's true again. So we said that from A to E is a fifth, because in our A scale, our A minor scale, the E was the fifth note, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But instead of counting the notes in the scale, now we're going to count the half steps in between those notes. So from A to A sharp is a half step. Remember, A is our 0 starting place. So we don't count A. Half step to A sharp, half step to B, that's 2 half steps, 3 half steps to C, 4 half steps to C sharp, 5 half steps to D, 6 to D sharp, and again we have 7 half steps that brings us to our fifth. So I know it's confusing. Why would 7 halves of something add up to 5? That doesn't make any sense mathematically, right? But it's 2 different ways of counting. Counting notes in a scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or counting half steps in between those notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So a fifth is always going to be 7 half steps. You could count starting from any key, any note on the whole keyboard. If you counted 7 half steps from any note, you'll get the fifth. So we started on B, and we counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That gives us our fifth up here at F sharp. So a fifth is 7 half steps. Then the next smallest interval after a half step is a whole step, and whole steps are just 2 half steps, right? 1 half step plus 1 half step equals 1 whole step. Simple, half whole. So if I ask you to start from C and then go up a whole step, that means counting 2 half steps, 1 to C sharp and 1 to D. Or instead of counting each one, you could just know that you're going to skip a note, you're going to skip a key, and then play the very next key. So from C to D is a whole step. If I asked you to play a whole step down from C, it would mean skipping B and landing on B flat. So again, when you're counting half steps and whole steps, pretend that every key is in one row. Pretend they're all the same. Don't get confused because some of them are smaller and black. So from C down to B flat is a whole step. Whole steps, got it? So now let's look at our C major scale as a pattern of whole steps and half steps. What are you talking about, Miss Nessa? What does that mean? Well, we're going to count from each note in our C major scale, and we're going to say, is that a whole step to the next note, or is it a half step to the next note? So we start on C. I already told you from C to D is a whole step, right? From D to E, what do you think? Well, there's a key in between, so it's going to be a whole step. So we have a whole step from C to D, a whole step from D to E. Our next note is F, and we already said from E to F is a half step because there's nothing in between. From F to G is a whole step because F sharp is in between. From G to A is a whole step. From A to B is a whole step. And then from B to C is a half step again because there's nothing in between. So if we counted from C to C, we would count a whole step, a whole step, a half step, a whole step, a whole step, a whole step, a half step. Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And this is the pattern that we're going to use for every major scale on the whole keyboard. So there's 11 more major scales after C, starting with the 11 other notes. You can start a major scale from any note, right? And there's 12 different notes. So if we use this pattern, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, we can build a major scale starting on any note. So let's try it with F, because F is just about as easy as C. From F, a whole step is going to count to G, right? We skip F sharp, we land on G, then we count another whole step, which means skipping G sharp and landing on A. So there's our whole step, then we need a half step, right? Whole step, half step. So a half step above A is going to be the very next key, which happens to be B flat. So F, whole step, half step. And then this might be a little tricky for some of you, but a whole step above B flat, even though we're starting on a black key, we're going to skip the white key next to it and then play the next white key after that. So a whole step from B flat to C here's whole step, half step, whole step to D, whole step to E, and then from E to F again is a half step, which brings us back to our octave. So whole step, half step, whole step, half step. So that's our F major scale. And the notes of that are F, G, A, B flat, C, D, E, and F, which is almost the same notes as our C major scale, right? It's still mostly white keys. We just have one accidental that we have to look out for, and that's B flat. So I'm using this organ sound. If you can find an organ sound on your instrument, that would be helpful. I'm going to play an F drone. A drone is just a note that goes on and on forever. So I'm going to play this F drone, and then I'm just going to noodle around. Noodling is like improvising. We learned about improvising last week, where you just make something up on the spot. But we're going to use those 7 notes in the F major scale, which another way to say that is we are playing in the key of F major. We are improvising in F major. So you can play along with me, or you can pause me or mute me and play by yourself, but I'm going to hold this F, and then I'm just going to explore some of the other notes in our scale. Now, if you accidentally hit a B while you were doing that, you would hear that it didn't really fit in with the other notes, right? Listen to this. Sounds a little uncomfortable, which it's totally okay for music to sound uncomfortable. I love music that sounds uncomfortable, but B is not part of our major scale, not part of our F major scale. So now let's try G major scale, which is going to be almost as easy as F, or maybe even easier because you already know F. So let's start on G. From G, we count a whole step to A, whole step to B, half step to C, whole step to D, whole step to E, whole step above E. We're going to skip F and land on F sharp, right? So don't get hung up on that. And then half step from F sharp brings us back to G. There's our octave. So whole step, half step, whole step, half step. G, B, C, F sharp, G. So you can hear the similarity, right? You can hear what makes a major scale a major scale, and that's what it is. It's the intervals, it's the pattern of whole steps and half steps. Now that you know that pattern, you could start from any key, anywhere on the keyboard, and I encourage you to do this, if not today, tomorrow. Start maybe, this time let's start from B. Let's try a hard one. So count from B and count a whole step, a half step, a whole step, a whole step, a whole step, a half step. Give that a try. I'm not going to do that here, but you could do it from all 12 of the keys, or all the different octaves, and build your own major scale. So instead of having you memorize every major scale, now you have the tools to figure it out when you need to. Now, if your brain is full, because I know we've covered a lot of ground already today, and we've moved really fast since last week, you could stop the video and watch the rest later. But I'm going to talk about now a similar pattern that we can use for minor scales, similar but a little bit different. So let's go back to our A minor scale. And let's try counting whole steps and half steps for that. So from A to B, what do you think? Whole step, right? Because there's a key in between, which is B flat. But from B to C, it's a half step, right? So there's nothing in between B to C, so that's a half step. So this is already different from our major scale, because remember our major scale started out with our first note and then went up a whole step and then another whole step. But for A minor, we're going a whole step to B, a half step to C, whole step to D, because there's that key in between, whole step to E, because there's that key in between, half step to F, nothing in between, whole step to G, because there's F sharp in between, and then a whole step from G to A, which brings us back to our octave. So let's count that again. Whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step. So, since you just learned the other pattern, it's probably going to be confusing. But this one is whole, half, whole, half, whole, whole. Whole, half, whole, half, whole. So it's still 7 steps that we're taking, right, between our 8 notes. And 2 of those steps are half steps, right, in our major pattern, which was whole, half, whole, half. 2 of those were half steps. And in our minor pattern, whole, half, half, whole. There's also 2 half steps, but they happen in different places. So that's how, we're counting the same distance. We're still counting an octave, but it's like we're playing hopscotch and we're taking a different pattern to get from the beginning to the end. So let's use that pattern, whole, half, whole, to find another minor scale. Let's start this time from D. So find your D and count a whole step, which is going to take you to E, skipping in between, there's D sharp. So whole, then it's a half step to F. So whole, half, another whole step from F to G, whole step from G to A, half step from A to B flat, and then a whole step from B flat to C. So our D, what did I just do? Oh yeah, I just didn't play the last note. Sorry about that. So from D to E, whole, E to F, half, F to G, whole, G to A, whole, A to B flat, half, and then from B flat to C, whole, and from C to D is whole. I just had my mind went blank for a moment. But, so our D minor scale goes D, E, F, G, A, B flat, C, D. So that has a similar feel to the A minor scale, right? We hear what makes it sound minor. Like those 3 major scales all sound in major. This sounds minor, like the A minor scale. And again, we only have 1 accidental. We're still using mostly the white keys. Our 1 accidental is B flat, which was the same as our F major scale, right? F major used B flat, and D minor also uses B flat, which if you remember from last week, I said that A minor and C major have all the same notes. They just start in a different place. So in the same way, F major and D minor use all the same notes. Now let's look at E minor. Let's start on E. Let's count up a whole step. Now don't get confused because we're counting a whole step above E means we're skipping F to F sharp, then a half step to G, then a whole step to A, whole step to B, half step to C, whole step to D, and whole step to E. So let's do that again. So the notes for E minor were E, F sharp, G, A, B, C, D, E, which is the same notes as we did for G major, right? So G major and E minor have the same notes. The accidental for both of them is the F sharp. So, did we do an improvisation for D minor? I think we skipped it. Let's do an improvisation for E minor. So hold down an E. I love minor scales, aren't they nice? I hope you came up with something that you like. That's it. This is a long video. We talked about a lot of stuff, but now you know the pattern for a major scale, which is a whole step, a whole step, a half step, a whole step, a whole step, a whole step, a half step, and the pattern for minor scales, which is a whole step, a half step, a whole step, a whole step, a half step, a whole step, a whole step. I sound like a robot reciting all this, but, you know, give it a try. Try it out. See if you can remember. Try playing the 3 major scales that you learned, which were C major, F major, and G major. And what do you hear that's similar? What do you hear that's different? Do they feel different to you? Do you like one better than the other? How about the minor scales? Do they feel... They definitely are going to feel different from the major scales, right? But do they feel different from each other? Is there one that sounds better to you? And is there one that's easier for you to sing? Is there one that fits your vocal range better? Because that's good to know when you're writing your own song. That's it. I'm not going to talk about scales ever again to anyone. But I love them. Scales are so important. You got to practice your scales. If you have any questions about scales or ideas about what you want to do in this class going forward, you can send an email to info@communityworksla.org, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.